Harlan County, Eastern Kentucky, November 1891. The first snow had already fallen when Samuel Orrin began clearing the ridge above Poor Fork Creek. His neighbors watched from their porches, shaking their heads. The man was building cabin, but not the kind anyone recognized. Word spread quickly through the valley. Orrin wasn't laying out the traditional rectangle. He was driving stakes in a perfect circle. "Man's lost his mind," declared James Bradley, the valley's most respected builder. 40 years I've been raising cabins. Never seen such foolishness." But Samuel Orrin had seen something others hadn't. In his years working timber crews across 3 states, he'd spent winters in structures most men dismissed as primitive. Structures that somehow held heat better than any cabin he'd ever built with his own hands. What did this quiet carpenter from Indiana understand about thermal efficiency that Kentucky's master builders missed? Before we reveal the answer that would silence every critic by February, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and subscribers get early access to our deep dive into frontier heating systems that'll change how you think about modern construction. Now, let's watch a man prove an entire valley wrong. In eastern Kentucky coal country, cabin building followed rules as old as the first settlements. 4 walls. For corners. Rectangular footprint between 16 and 20 feet. Logs notched and stacked with precision joinery that had come down through generations of German and Scots-Irish builders. Samuel Orrin knew these rules. He followed them for 15 years across Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky. Built 43 cabins by his own count, every one square or rectangular. Every one exactly like his neighbors expected, until Poor Fork Creek. Orrin had arrived in Harlan County in spring of 1891, hired to supervise timber operations for a Cincinnati lumber company. He was 41 years old, unmarried, and quiet in a way that made people uneasy. He didn't drink, didn't attend church socials, spent his evenings sketching in a leather-bound notebook that nobody ever saw inside. When he purchased 4 acres on the ridge that October, folks assumed he'd build standard. Put up a respectable 18 by 22 cabin, maybe add a lean-to for tools. Settle into valley life like a sensible man. The circular foundation trench changed everything. "Samuel," James Bradley called out on the 3rd day of excavation. "You marking a well?" "Foundation," Orrin replied, not looking up from his work. Bradley dismounted, walked the perimeter of the trench, measuring with his practiced eye. 26 feet across. Perfect circle. He'd built enough structures to know this wasn't ignorance. This was intention. "You planning to build round?" "I am. Can't be done proper. Logs won't stack right. Roof won't pitch. You'll have gaps wide enough to throw a cat through." Orrin straightened, wiping sweat despite the November chill. "Appreciate the concern, James." That night, Bradley gathered 5 men at McKinney's store. "Man's gonna freeze to death come January," he told them. "Somebody needs to talk sense before he wastes good timber on whatever fool notion got into his head." They tried. Over the next 2 weeks, a procession of valley men climbed that ridge. Offered advice. Offered to help him lay out proper corners. Offered to buy his land if he wanted to move somewhere his experimental notions wouldn't get him killed. Orrin listened politely to each one. Thanked them for their time. Kept digging his circular foundation trench 18 inches deep. By late November, when he began hauling sandstone for the foundation itself, the mockery had spread beyond Harlan County. Orrin's round cabin became a cautionary tale told in neighboring valleys. The kind of story old-timers shared to illustrate what happened when book learning replaced common sense. Probably read about it in some fancy magazine, one builder scoffed. "These Indiana fellows come down here thinking Kentucky men don't know timber." But Samuel Orrin hadn't read about circular cabins in any magazine. He'd spent 3 winters in Lakota territory, sleeping in teepees that held heat so efficiently they required half the fuel of the Army barracks. He'd worked a season in Alaska, where he'd seen Aleut barraburras, semi-subterranean round houses that stayed warm in temperatures that killed unprepared men. He'd watched, measured, and understood something about circles that rectangular-thinking builders had never considered. Heat doesn't gather in corners, because corners don't exist in nature's most efficient forms. The sandstone foundation rose in a perfect ring, 18 inches wide, 2 feet above grade. Samuel Oren laid each stone himself, refusing help even when valley men offered out of pity for his doomed project. What they saw as stubbornness was actually precision. Every stone selected for specific thermal properties. Dense sandstone from the creek bed, not the lighter limestone from the ridge. Each piece weighing between 40 and 60 pounds. Each positioned to create a continuous thermal mass with no gaps, no corners, no points where cold could concentrate and radiate inward. Foundation's the only part he's doing right, Bradley admitted to his crew. Shame he's going to waste it on a circle. But the foundation wasn't just right. It was deliberately engineered for heat retention in ways rectangular cabins never achieved. A traditional rectangular cabin had 4 corners. 8, if you counted the foundation. Each corner created a thermal weak point, a place where 2 surfaces met at 90 degrees, forming a junction that radiated heat outward more efficiently than flat walls. Physics called it edge effect. Builders called it cold corners and accepted them as inevitable. Oren's circle had 0 corners, 0 edge effects. The continuous curve meant heat radiating from the interior wall surface had nowhere to concentrate and escape. Instead, it distributed evenly around the entire circumference, creating uniform warmth that rectangular geometry couldn't match. The mathematics were simple. A circle provided the maximum interior volume for the minimum exterior surface area. Less surface area meant less heat loss. A 26-foot diameter circle gave Oren 530 square feet of floor space, identical to a 23 by 23 rectangular cabin. But his circular wall measured only 81.6 feet around. The rectangular equivalent required 92 feet of wall. That 11-foot difference meant 11 fewer feet radiating heat into freezing air. 11 fewer feet requiring chinking. 11 fewer feet where wind could find gaps and steal warmth. By mid-December, when Oren began raising the walls, the engineering advantages became visible to anyone willing to look past their assumptions. He'd selected white oak exclusively, not the mixed hardwoods typical of valley cabins, but uniform white oak logs between 14 and 16 inches in diameter. Each log carefully curved, not bent, but selected from naturally curved growth on hillside trees where prevailing winds had shaped the grain. Traditional notching wouldn't work on a curve, so Orr developed his own joinery. Each log tapered on both ends, fitting into custom carved channels in the logs above and below. The result looked impossible. Curved walls rising without gaps, each log supporting its neighbors in continuous compression. It'll collapse, first snow, predicted Thomas McKinney, who'd built 17 cabins in his 63 years. Curves can't bear load like straight walls. But McKinney misunderstood the physics. Straight walls bore weight through vertical compression. Curved walls distributed stress around the entire circumference. Each log in Oren's circle pushed against its neighbors, creating a self-supporting structure that actually grew stronger under load. Like a barrel, like an arch, like every enduring structure humans had built before they fell in love with right angles. Hit that like button if you're starting to see what Kentucky's master builders missed. Subscribe for the next chapter where we reveal the central fireplace design that made this engineering complete. And comment below. Have you ever seen a round cabin in person? I want to hear your stories. January brought the walls to shoulder height. Samuel Oren worked alone in temperatures that kept most men indoors. His hands stayed warmer than they should have, locals noticed. The circular wall rising around him seemed to trap ambient heat, even without a roof. The central fireplace began taking shape. This was where experienced builders expected vindication. Round walls were one thing, peculiar but possible. A functional fireplace in a circular cabin was another matter entirely. Traditional wisdom said fireplaces belonged on exterior walls. Build them into the gable end. Use the outside air for draft. Let the chimney mass brace the structure. James Bradley had built 43 fireplaces this way, every single one on an exterior wall. Orrin's fireplace rose from the exact center of the circle. "Now I know he's mad," Bradley told his wife. "Putting your heat source in the middle means the chimney can't support nothing, and he's going to lose half his floor space to stonework." But Orrin understood something about radial heat distribution that exterior fireplaces could never achieve. A fireplace on an exterior wall radiated heat in a 180-degree arc at best. Half the thermal energy went straight into the wall and out through the logs. The stone chimney, rising up the exterior, conducted heat directly into outside air. Efficient for the wilderness beyond your walls. Wasteful for the family inside. A central fireplace radiated heat in a full 360-degree circle. Every BTU stayed inside the living space. The chimney mass, 4,200 pounds of sandstone rising 12 feet, sat entirely within the heated envelope, storing thermal energy instead of bleeding it to the sky. Orrin built the firebox 8 inches smaller than Valley Standard, not from lack of materials, but from understanding. A smaller, hotter fire produced more complete combustion and less creosote. It required less wood and generated more usable heat. The smoke chamber above employed a design he'd seen in Russian settlements in Alaska, a series of baffles that forced hot gases to give up their heat before exiting through the flue. The circular wall made the central fireplace work even better. Heat radiated outward, struck the curved interior surface, and reflected back toward the center. The cabin became its own parabolic reflector. In a rectangular cabin, heat traveled to the corners and died. In Orrin's circle, heat had nowhere to hide. By late January, with the roof framing beginning, Valley opinion had calcified into certainty. Samuel Orrin had built an expensive, labor-intensive mistake. Come February's worst cold, he'd abandon his folly and beg for shelter in a proper cabin. Thomas McKinney made this prediction publicly at the store. "Mail be knocking on my door by Valentine's Day," half froze and humbled. Others were less charitable. Some suggested Orrin's strange design proved he'd never intended to survive the winter at all, that this was some elaborate form of giving up without the shame of obvious suicide. But Orrin kept working, laid split oak shingles in overlapping rings on the conical roof, chinked the walls with a mixture of clay and deer hair he'd prepared in November, built simple furniture that followed the curve of the walls, a bed alcove, shelving, a workbench that wrapped a quarter of the circumference. He moved in on February 3rd, 1892. The chimney smoke rose straight and strong. Light glowed from the single window he'd fitted with oiled paper. Inside, the temperature held at 64 degrees Fahrenheit, while outside, air measured 31. One small fire, for split logs, the kind of fuel consumption that would barely warm a corner of a traditional cabin. Nobody knew yet. The real test was still coming. February 11th, 1892. The barometer at McKinney's store began falling at noon. Old men recognized the signs. The wind shifted northwest. The sky took on that peculiar yellow-gray color that preceded the valley's worst storms. By evening, the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, 9 degrees. The wind rose to what local accounts described as strong enough to carry a man's hat 3 farms over. February 12th dawned at 4 below zero. In 40 years of Harlan County records kept by the Presbyterian minister, this was the 3rd coldest morning ever documented. The kind of cold that killed livestock in their barns, that froze water buckets solid in kitchens, that turned poorly built cabins into wooden tombs. James Bradley woke at first light, started his fire, and began the winter ritual every Valley family knew. Feed the fire. Wait. Feed it again. Keep feeding it all day if you wanted to survive. By 8 a.m., with a roaring fire consuming split oak at a rate of 1 log every 30 minutes, Bradley's cabin measured 48 degrees Fahrenheit near the hearth, 41 degrees in the sleeping corner farthest from the fire. His children huddled under every quilt the family owned. Across the valley, similar scenes played out in 18 other cabins. Men fed fires. Women boiled water for hot bricks to warm the beds. Children stayed within arm's reach of the hearth. The community's collective wood consumption that day would later be estimated at 340 logs, an average of just under 19 logs per household over 16 hours of brutal cold. On the ridge above Poor Fork Creek, Samuel Orrin woke at his customary 5 a.m. The interior temperature of his round cabin read 61 degrees Fahrenheit. He had not fed the fire since 9 p.m. the previous evening. The coals from last night's 4 logs still glowed red in the central hearth, radiating gentle heat into the 4,200 pounds of sandstone chimney mass. That thermal battery was releasing stored BTUs at a steady rate, warming the curved walls, which reflected heat back toward the center, which kept the cycle going. Orrin added 3 logs, not from necessity, but from habit. He made coffee, ate cornmeal mush, sat at his curved workbench, and continued carving the chair spindles he'd been working on all week. At 10 a.m., when the outdoor temperature reached its minimum, 6 degrees below zero, his cabin interior measured 67 degrees. He was wearing a shirt and vest. No coat, no hat. Comfortable. Thomas McKinney was the first to notice. He'd climbed the ridge to check on Orrin, expecting to find the man in distress or worse. What he found instead stopped him in the snow 20 yards from the door. The smoke from Orrin's chimney rose thin and lazy. Not the thick, desperate smoke of a fire being desperately fed. The kind of smoke that came from a small, efficient fire maintaining comfortable heat. McKinney knocked. Orrin answered in shirt sleeves. You're not freezing? Come in, Thomas. Coffee's hot. McKinney stepped inside and felt the warmth wrap around him like a blanket. His eyes went to the fire. For logs. Small fire. But the heat was everywhere. Not concentrated near the hearth and dying toward the walls. Everywhere. Uniform. Gentle. Persistent. He looked at the curved walls. At the central chimney. At the complete absence of cold corners where frost formed and families huddled away from. How much would you burn since last night? 7 logs since I banked the fire at 9. McKinney had burned 11 logs by 10 a.m. alone, and his cabin was barely livable. What's the temperature in here? Orrin showed him the thermometer he'd hung on the wall. 67 degrees. In weather that was killing animals in their shelters. McKinney stayed 20 minutes. Long enough to understand he was standing in something that invalidated 40 years of what he thought he knew about keeping a cabin warm. When he descended to the valley, he said nothing, but his face said everything. James Bradley saw it. So did others. The round cabin worked. Not just worked. Thrived. The cold held for 6 days. February 12th through 17th, temperatures never rose above 15 degrees Fahrenheit during daylight hours. Nights dropped to 0 or below. The wind maintained its brutal northwest angle, finding every gap in every cabin wall, stealing heat faster than fires could replace it. Valley families burned through their February wood supplies in 4 days. Men ventured into the forest despite the cold, cutting and hauling fresh timber to keep fires going. The communal woodpile at McKinney's store, reserved for emergencies, was depleted by the 15th. Samuel Orrin burned 42 logs over those 6 days. An average of 7 logs per day. 1 log every 3.5 hours. James Bradley burned 127 logs in the same period. 21 per day. Nearly 1 log per waking hour. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Orrin's round cabin consumed 67% less wood than Bradley's rectangular cabin of nearly identical square footage. Not 10% less. Not 20% less. 2/3 less. But the fuel consumption told only part of the story. On February 16th, Bradley invited Orrin to bring his thermometer down to the valley. A dozen families gathered at McKinney's store to witness what local accounts later called the measuring. First, they measured Bradley's cabin at 2 p.m. during the warmest part of the day, with a full fire roaring. The thermometer read 52 degrees Fahrenheit at the hearth wall, 43 degrees in the sleeping corner. Then they climbed the ridge to Orrin's cabin. He'd let his morning fire burn down to coals. Had not added wood since 11 a.m. It was now 2:15 p.m. The thermometer read 66 degrees. Not at the hearth. at the curved wall farthest from the fire. They measured 6 different points around the interior. The readings varied by only 3 degrees. 64 at the coldest point, 67 at the warmest. The round cabin maintained uniform temperature throughout its entire volume. Bradley's cabin varied by 9 degrees between hearth and corners, and that was with a fire consuming fuel at 3 times Oren's rate. Like and subscribe if you're seeing how completely the evidence destroyed every assumption these experienced builders held. Comment below, what's the coldest temperature you've ever kept a home warm in? Next chapter reveals how quickly this design spread once pride stopped getting in the way. The measurements continued. They tested heat retention by letting both fires go cold simultaneously at 6 p.m. By 9 p.m., Bradley's cabin had dropped to 39 degrees. Oren's cabin measured 58 degrees, a 19-degree difference from identical starting points, 3 hours after fuel stopped being added. The curved walls and central thermal mass were releasing stored heat. The absence of corners meant no cold zones where temperature could plummet. The circular geometry created natural convection currents that distributed warmth without effort. Thomas McKinney ran his hand along the interior wall of Oren's cabin. The logs felt warm to the touch. He walked to Bradley's cabin and did the same. The logs there felt cold, except within 2 feet of the fireplace. "The whole cabin's a heater," McKinney said quietly. "Not just the fire, the whole structure." Oren nodded. "Thermal mass. The stone stores heat during the day. The logs absorb it from the inside surface. At night, they release it back. The circle keeps it circulating instead of escaping through corners." How'd you know this would work? Didn't know, for certain. But I'd seen it work in other forms. Teepees, round lodges, barrel roofs. Every culture that survived hard winters without unlimited fuel figured out that circles hold heat better than squares. Took me 3 winters in Dakota Territory to stop being too proud to learn from it. That night, 7 Valley men asked Oren if he'd consult on their next builds. Not round cabins, necessarily. But would he share what he knew about thermal mass, about central heat sources, about eliminating cold corners? By February 18th, when the temperature finally rose above freezing, the story of the round cabin had spread to 4 neighboring counties. Oren received visitors from as far as 50 miles away. Men who wanted to see this impossible structure that stayed warm on 7 logs a day. Some came skeptical and left convinced. Others came convinced and left humbled. James Bradley came on February 20th, stood in the center of Oren's cabin, looking up at the circular roof, at the central chimney, at the curved walls that had proven him wrong about everything he thought he knew. "I owe you an apology, Samuel." "No need. You built 43 good cabins, kept 43 families alive. That's nothing to apologize for. But I called you a fool. You called my design foolish. Then winter proved which one of us was right. That's not character. That's just being wrong about circles." Bradley smiled despite himself. "Will you teach me? Not to build round necessarily, but the principles, the thermal mass, the geometry, whatever you're willing to share. I'll share all of it. But the best teacher is winter. And winter just taught us both something about the difference between tradition and truth." Spring of 1892 brought the first imitator. Not a full circle, but something that showed Samuel Oren's influence had taken root. Jacob Morse, a farmer 3 miles down Poor Fork Creek, began building a new cabin in late March. Traditional rectangular footprint, 20 by 24 feet. But he positioned his fireplace in the center of the long wall instead of the gable end. And he rounded the interior corners, not dramatically, but enough to eliminate the sharp 90-degree angles where cold had always gathered in his old place. Borrowed some ideas from Oren, Morse told James Bradley when a master builder stopped to observe. "Not going full round, but figure if curves hold heat better, might as well use what works." Bradley said nothing. But that night, he pulled out his sketching paper for the first time in months. Started drawing cabin plans that incorporated thermal mass principles, central hearth positions, curved corner designs that traditional joinery could accommodate. By summer, 3 more families had consulted Oren on their building plans. He charged nothing for the advice. spent evenings sketching modifications that would improve heat retention without requiring radical departures from familiar construction methods. Not everyone needs to build round, he explained to Thomas McKinney. The circle works because of specific principles. Thermal mass, radial heat distribution, eliminating corners. You can apply those principles in degrees. Even small changes make measurable differences. The fall of 1892 saw the first true replication. A young couple named Harris, newly married and building their first home on Clover Fork, asked Orrin to supervise a full circular cabin, 22 feet in diameter instead of Orrin's 26. Single story instead of the loft Orrin had added, but employing every thermal principle he'd proven the previous winter. Orrin spent 2 weeks helping them lay the foundation, teaching the curved joinery, explaining the central hearth design. The Harris cabin rose in October, stood complete by early November, and faced its first test during a cold snap in late December. Local accounts indicate the Harris cabin maintained 63-degree interior temperature on 6 logs per day when neighboring rectangular cabins of similar size burned 9 to 11 logs to achieve 48 to 52 degrees. The evidence was replicating. The design was reproducible. What had been dismissed as one man's lucky aberration was proving to be sound engineering that anyone could learn and apply. Word spread beyond Harlan County. By spring of 1893, Orrin received letters from Tennessee, Virginia, and Southern Ohio. Builders asking for specifications. Families asking if he'd consult on their construction. One letter came from a university professor in Lexington who wanted to study the thermal properties of circular architecture for a paper on vernacular engineering. Orrin declined the professor politely. "I'm a carpenter, not a scientist." Why no came from watching people who'd figured out how to survive with less. If the university wants to study heat retention, they should talk to the Lakota, the Aleut, the Russians who've been building round structures in Siberia for 1,000 years. I just paid attention to what already worked. But he answered every letter from working families, sent sketches, explained principles, encouraged people to adapt rather than copy exactly. "Your climate isn't Kentucky's climate," he wrote to a family in Minnesota. "Your available materials aren't mine. Use the principles, but solve for your specific conditions." By 1895, local estimates suggested 17 cabins within 50 miles of Harlan County incorporated circular or partially circular design elements specifically attributed to Orrin's influence. Not all were full circles. Most were hybrid approaches, rectangular cabins with rounded corners, central fireplaces with radial stone mass, curved additions to existing structures. The total wood savings across those 17 structures, calculated from reported consumption during the winter of 1895 to 96, exceeded 1,200 logs compared to traditional rectangular equivalents. That represented approximately 14 cords of hardwood, hundreds of hours of cutting and hauling. The difference between comfortable survival and desperate fuel gathering for families living on the margin. James Bradley built his last cabin in 1897. Rectangular because the family requesting it wanted traditional appearance. But Bradley incorporated a central hearth with 3,800 pounds of thermal mass. Rounded the interior corners with a subtle curve that most visitors never noticed. Oriented the structure to minimize wind exposure on the coldest side. Learn from a man who was willing to be wrong about everything I thought I knew, Bradley told his apprentice while they worked. Turnout Circle's been teaching that lesson since the first human figured out a round hut beats a square one in winter. Just took a quiet fellow from Indiana to make us remember. Before we close this story, do this. Hit that like button if you've learned something that'll change how you think about traditional building. Subscribe because next month we're revealing the Russian stove design that one immigrant family used to heat 1,800 square feet on 3 logs per day. And comment below. Would you build a round cabin? I want to know if this knowledge is something you'd actually use. Samuel Orrin lived in his round cabin for 23 years. Never married. Never built another structure for himself. The cabin stood exactly as completed in February 1892. Curved walls, central hearth, conical roof shedding snow, and even rings around its circumference. He continued timber work until age 60, then retired to the ridge above Poor Fork Creek. Neighbors reported smoke rising from his chimney in the thinnest column they'd ever seen from an occupied dwelling. Visitors found him comfortable in weather that sent them shivering despite heavy coats. In winter of 1914, at age 64, Orrin contracted pneumonia, refused to leave his cabin for treatment in town. Thomas McKinney's son, now a builder himself, trained in the principles Orrin had shared, visited 3 times during Orrin's final week. Place was still warm. The younger McKinney recorded in his journal, maybe 61, 62 degrees. Small fire. He was reading by the hearth, wrapped in one quilt. Told me the cabin had taken care of him for 22 winters. Figured it would see him through the last one just fine. Samuel Orrin died on February 9th, 1915, 23 years and 2 days after the brutal cold that had proven his design sound. The round cabin stood empty for 2 years. Then a young family named Patterson, newly arrived from Virginia, purchased the ridge property. They'd heard stories about the warm cabin and wanted to test them personally. The Patterson family lived there for 18 years, raised 4 children in that circular space, reported fuel consumption that remained consistent with Orrin's original numbers, 6 to 8 logs per day in the coldest weather, comfortable interior temperatures while neighbors burned twice the wood for half the warmth. In 1935, a particularly harsh winter struck eastern Kentucky. Temperatures dropped to 12 below zero on January 18th. The Patterson cabin, now 43 years old, maintained 64-degree interior temperature on 7 logs. The same performance it had delivered when new. The structure Orrin built lasted until 1967, 75 years of Kentucky winters. When it finally came down, not from structural failure, but from the family's decision to build larger, the curved white oak logs showed minimal rot. The central chimney stood sound enough to incorporate into the new construction. The principles outlasted the structure. Today, scattered across Appalachia, you can find cabins that trace their design lineage to that quiet carpenter who built round when everyone said build square. Not many are true circles. Most are hybrid forms, rectangular cabins with thermal mass principles, curved corners, central hearths that radiate heat instead of bleeding it through exterior walls. But the knowledge persists. The understanding that traditional doesn't always mean optimal. That indigenous peoples, frontier settlers, and immigrants from cold climates had solved problems that modern building sometimes forgets in favor of convention. The round cabin wasn't invented in Kentucky in 1891. Humans have been building circular structures for warmth since before recorded history. Teepees, yurts, roundhouses, barrabaras, igloos. Every culture that faced serious cold with limited fuel eventually discovered the same truth. Circles hold heat better than squares. Samuel Orrin's contribution wasn't inventing the wheel. It was having the humility to recognize that the wheel already existed. That dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often revealed not their ignorance, but ours. The Lakota who taught him, without knowing they were teaching, about teepee heat retention weren't backward. They were solving complex thermodynamic problems with elegant geometric solutions. The Aleut builders whose barrabaras stayed warm in Alaskan winters weren't primitive. They were practicing advanced thermal engineering without the vocabulary modern science would later develop to explain why it worked. Orrin simply paid attention, tested, proved what survival had already taught cultures that couldn't afford to be wrong about staying warm. In 1892, that proof manifested as 22 degrees of difference, as 67% fuel savings, as the gap between comfortable survival and desperate cold for families living on the edge of winter's killing power. The exact numbers mattered because they were measurable, undeniable, the kind of evidence that changed minds and saved lives. But the deeper truth was simpler. When you stop being too proud to learn from those who survived before you, you discover that ancient and primitive are not synonyms for wrong. Sometimes they're synonyms for proven. Hit that like button one final time. Subscribe for more stories about frontier engineering that modern building forgot. And comment below with the biggest lesson you're taking from Samuel Orne's round cabin. Because the real question isn't whether you'll build a circle. It's whether you'll stay humble enough to recognize that the people who came before us, whether frontier carpenters or indigenous nations, often knew exactly what they were doing. Winter has a way of teaching that lesson. Samuel Oren just had the courage to be the student.